So thank you, ma'am, so much for a nice talk. So my third topic of the first session is protein, the missing link between cardiometabolic and renal health by Dr. by Dr. Chaavi Kohli. Please welcome Chaavi Kohli, ma'am. Please come on the dais. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. Very good morning. So today I'll discuss or share some insights about proteins, which is the missing link between cardiometabolic and renal health. So in this presentation, we'll primarily focus on the important factors which leads to cardiometabolic and renal issues and what is the role of protein in them. So if we talk about the cardiometabolic issues, so cardiometabolic disease is a clinical syndrome in which there is a causal relationship between metabolic issues as well as the cardiovascular pathology. And this condition is classified into or includes certain other issues also like obesity, type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So if we talk about the statistics, what is the scenario worldwide? So in the world, 671 million people worldwide suffer from obesity, 439 million people from type 2 diabetes and 523 million from cardiovascular diseases. But the total burden of economic burden of these issues is around $6.3 trillion. But if we see the Indian scenario, in India, CVD death rate is 272 per 1 lakh population in India, and which is higher than the global average estimate. If we want to understand the contributing factors, the primary contributing factors for the cardiometabolic issues are primarily eating behavior, suboptimal nutrition, and atmospheric pollution, which has been recorded in different studies. Now here we'll focus on eating behavior and suboptimal nutrition. In a meta-analysis including 21,942 participants compared the efficacy of 14 popularly named dietary programs in terms of weight loss and cardiovascular risk reduction, and wherein different dietary regimens were studied like low carbohydrate, high protein diets, low fat diets, moderate macronutrient diets like DASH and Mediterranean diets, and it showed a significant reduction in weight and blood pressure after 6 months compared to the average diets when these different diets were followed. So when we talk about different diets, so why are we talking about different diets? What these diets have in common? These diets have certain arrangement of nutrients which might be different from the average consumption which people usually consume. So if we talk about the nutrition and the eating behaviors, then when we compare the nutritional composition of different meals, or if we talk about the different nutrients, there is one nutrient which is the protein, which receives relatively less attention as compared to fat and carbohydrate. If we see the distribution of all the macronutrients, among all macronutrients, protein is the nutrient which is required in less amount as compared to the per percentage of calories as compared to fat and carbohydrate. But when we see the sources of protein, there are not many sources which gives good amount of protein, specifically when we talk about the vegetarian sources. So large amounts are present in limited food items, very high intakes are infrequent, and this results in usually a very moderate kind of a protein intake. If we talk about the Western population, so there the protein intake ranges from 12% to 20%. That is the average intake of the population in economically stronger section of the society. But what is the scenario and what is the protein recommendations? Protein recommendations which are recommended worldwide is 0.8 gram per kg body weight. That is the worldwide recommendation, and that is common for Indian population also. But it is being recommended that for certain situations protein intake should be increased, like in older population, as they have high chance of muscle loss. So for them they should focus on 1 to 1.2 gram per kg body weight per day. And there are studies which have noticed that in adults who are involved in exercise training, they should focus on protein intake more than 1.2 grams per kg body weight. So why it is important to talk about this protein? Because if we see the Indian scenario, so what we saw was the worldwide recommendation, which is very common or which is similar to the Indian population. But what is happening worldwide is people in economically better sections who are non-vegetarians, they are able to fulfill their protein requirement of 12 to 20%. But in India, where the average requirement is 0.8 gram, the average intake is 0.6 gram per kg of body weight in Indian population. A 2017 survey has showed that 73% of the Indians are deficient in protein, while above 90% are unaware of the daily requirements of protein because they assume that they are having enough proteins. A recent survey around 16 cities in India have discussed the perception and the knowledge about protein, and it was found that there is a huge gap between the perception of the sources of the protein quality and their needs and what is the role of protein. Even many people think that protein is the main culprit for weight gain, and that is why they tend to avoid these nutrients. So in a meta-analysis wherein which discussed the dietary protein and changes in the markers of cardiometabolic health across 20 years of follow-up in middle-aged Americans, they found that protein has a favorable association with systolic blood pressure and EGFR. Protein from animal sources was unfavorably associated with changes in fasting glucose and favorably associated with systolic blood pressure. Plant proteins was favorably associated with waist circumference, and there was a strong relationship between the total protein intake and changes in fasting glucose driven by the animal protein intake. Two recent meta-analyses on protein intake suggested that the higher protein intake, particularly when replacing carbohydrate intake, have favorable impact on blood pressure and the risk of hypertension. Also, pan-European diet, obesity and gene study of protein intake highlighted that during the weight maintenance time, if the protein intake is optimized, then it helps in sustainable changes in the fasting blood glucose. But in all the studies, the scenario was quite similar, that when we increase the protein intake, it gives positive impact. Usually how protein intake is assessed in the larger studies, so they divide the protein intake of entire population into percentile, and then they see the higher percentile and the lower percentile as higher and lower protein intake. In certain studies wherein the quantity of protein is regulated by per gram, therein the high protein diets, whenever they are mentioned, they actually mention a consumption of more than 20% of the protein as per the calories. Again, this becomes very variable in obese and overweight individuals, wherein the actual calorie intake is very different from what is needed, or the actual ideal weight and the weight difference between the ideal weight and actual weight is huge. So in both the scenarios, protein intake calculation becomes quite tricky. And certain studies, many studies have highlighted that apart from the total protein, the main factor which affects the cardiometabolic health is the protein package. Now, what is the protein package? Protein package discuss the influence of the other nutrients which are present with the protein. That is how different sources of proteins can behave differently in the body, and it can affect or it can show its effect on different cardiometabolic issues. So the nutritional characteristics of the foods containing protein is considered in the whole food package or protein package. So if we see the animal proteins, so animal proteins are generally, they are rich in certain nutrients like zinc, vitamin B12 and iron. But there are some negative influences of certain nutrients like saturated fatty acids and cholesterol, as compared to the plant sources which are more rich in fiber as well as phenolic compounds and PUFA. So these are the other nutrients which are non-protein nutrients. They show their effect on metabolic factors. Now the other thing which is quite responsible for showing different changes in the body is the behavioral and the social factors governing food choices. Like in different parts of the countries, it was observed that higher intakes of total meat was associated with lower intakes of vegetable, fruits and cereals in Europe. Then red meat intake was associated with lower intakes of fruits, whole grains and nuts in Finland. And the lower meat-fish ratio was a strong determinant of diet quality and nutrient profile in Japan. And it was also noticed that in a population who are fish eaters, they usually eat more amount of vegetables as compared to the population who are meat eaters. So in this trial, wherein the total animal and vegetable protein and incidence of type 2 diabetes was seen, here different sources of proteins were replaced by one of the vegetarian sources of proteins, primarily legumes and nuts. And the situation which was observed was participants in the highest quintiles of percentage of energy derived from animal proteins had 13% increased risk of type 2 diabetes compared with those of lower quintiles. And percentage of energy intake from vegetable protein was associated with moderately decreased risk of type 2 diabetes. When 5% of the energy intake of the animal protein source was replaced from the vegetable protein sources, then 23% reduction in the risk of type 2 diabetes was observed. Even in this study, the replacement of potatoes and refined grains with the protein also resulted in the reduction in the chances of type 2 diabetes. In another trial, a big trial, they have seen the effect of types of protein on the cardiovascular risk factors, and it was found that they compared the two groups, the meat protein factors and the nuts and seeds protein factor. So on comparing the highest with the lowest quintile, 61% of the higher risk was found for the meat protein factor and 40% lower risk for the nuts and seeds protein factor. But there was a very strong association among young adults aged 25 to 44 years of age, wherein there was 100% higher risk for the meat protein factor as compared to the nuts and seeds, where there was 60% lower risk. So what is the Indian scenario? If we see the Indian population, so there most of the people or many people are vegetarian. So we primarily rely on plant sources of protein, that is vegetarian sources of protein. Even people who eat non-vegetarian sources, many of them do not eat them very frequently, or intake of red meat is not as frequent as Western population in the most of the Indian population. But what is the problem? People do eat non-veg, people do eat egg, people do eat legumes and dals, but the problem is in the quantity, the quantum of food which is eaten. So Indian diets are
Dr.
predominantly
Kohli, try
cereal
to
based,
finish in 3 minutes if possible.
and 60% of the protein is derived from cereals with the poor digestibility. And even people don't spend too much on protein rich sources as they must spend on carbohydrate sources. So if we talk about the renal health, even the optimum amount of protein intake or higher protein intake does not affect the renal health also. And daily protein intake up to 1.6 gram per kg body weight also do not have long-term bad effect on renal health in healthy individuals, not in people who are suffering from renal disease. But if we talk about the protein in chronic kidney disease, it is known that protein intake should be less in chronic kidney disease, but here a very important thing which should be considered, ki when studies talk about less protein intake, what is the range they are talking about? They are actually talking about the range of 0.5 to 0.6 gram per kg per day, and this is the actual requirement for Indians, or this is the actual intake of Indians. So when we talk about the protein intake in people who are suffering from renal issues, rather than telling them to avoid protein, it's better we should first understand how much protein they are taking, and better to optimize the quality of the food, because in them the quality of the food which they take will influence their renal health more than protein restriction. And with the perception, anybody who is suffering from renal disease, they know one thing, that they have to restrict protein. They just know one thing. Most of the time they don't understand they have to control their sugar or blood pressure, or they have to control the sodium which is coming from the processed food. But they are aware of the fact that they should restrict protein. So that is why we should not talk about protein restriction at the first go when we are dealing with people with renal disease. Rather than we should talk about the optimum intake first, and better to count in front of them how much protein their diet is giving, because when we write the diet on the paper, they presume that it is too much of protein. Even one katori of dal, they assume gives them 40 to 50 grams of protein, but it hardly gives 5 to 6 grams of protein. So this is how our Indian minds play. When you ask them ki, you know, do you eat sufficient protein, the instant answer which we get, हाँ हम दाल रोज खाते हैं. So you ask them कि आप दिन में 2 बार खाते हैं, they will say नहीं नहीं एक बार हम खाते हैं, हम तो दाल खाते हैं. And in the studies, the vegetarian protein which studies the positive effect which we have seen is of legumes, nuts and seeds. So what people think about legumes, they are heavy. So उसे तो ज़्यादा नहीं खाना चाहिए. Diabetes है तो राजमा, छोले, चने ये सब नहीं खाने चाहिए. But these are all legumes. Nuts and seeds ज़्यादा खाएंगे तो गर्मी हो जाएगी. हमारा बीपी बढ़ जाएगा, हार्ट के लिए अच्छा नहीं है. So you know all these perceptions, because of all these perceptions, in spite of a population which rely primarily on plant sources of protein, the population is not able to take sufficient amount of protein. So these things should be readily discussed while the counseling sessions, so that people can make more better choices for themselves. That is why it is important to focus on this nutrient. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaavi Kohli, for a nice talk.